Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts. My name is Jillian McMaster. I'm the manager of publications and media, and I'm so glad that you're joining us tonight for the first of two curators talks about Bernini and the Roman Baroque masterpieces from Palazzo Chigi and Ariccia. If you're joining us on Facebook or Zoom, please feel free to use the chat area to ask questions. And also be sure to join us a week from now for Let's Talk Art, and on Thursday, August 12th at 6 for the second part of the curators talks. Everybody, please welcome the museum's Agnita M. Stine Schreiber curator, Daniel Fulco.
Thank you very much, Jillian. And it is a great pleasure tonight to speak to you all about some very exciting works and an exhibition that we have going on now at the museum. And if you give me one moment, I'm going to share my screen with you with a PowerPoint. And the exhibition that we currently have on view at the museum that's inspired this talk tonight is called Bernini and the Roman Baroque, Masterpieces from Palazzo Chigi and Ariccia. It comes at a momentous time in the museum's history because it's our first exhibition of old masters in many years, at least since 1965, of this many different kinds of works. And it's so special because it comes from a princely collection over in Italy, specifically the Palazzo Chigi in the hill town outside of Rome, about 16 kilometers southeast of Rome in the Alban Hills. And the show brings together more than 50 works by 40 artists. And they all come from this palazzo here, Palazzo Chigi. And this collection is assembled by, much of it by this man named Flavio Chigi. And as we go forward with our programming, we're going to be talking more about the Palazzo Chigi itself, which is today actually an active museum. So there are lots of exciting works to see in this tonight, and I'm going to be sort of organizing the talk based around the life of Bernini, sort of loosely. And tonight I'll probably get through about the first half of his life through roughly the 1640s and split it up because there is so much to discuss. Bernini is such a major artistic personality. And one of the things that I would like to point out is that if you do live in our region or you're able to get there, we encourage you to come and see this exhibition. It opened at the end of June, as you can see there, but it runs all the way until September 19th. So as I begin here, I just would like to point out, let's see if I can get this one moment. I have my this bar here is at the top of the screen. There we go. Put it down at the bottom. Just a couple of the key themes. The exhibition tries to show the influence of Bernini on Roman Baroque art. That is one of its main purposes. It tries to illustrate his concept of something that's called in Italian the bel composto, or beautiful whole. And Bernini believed that you could combine all of the visual arts. And in fact, he went beyond that to be thinking about architecture, sculpture, and decoration, but also the performing arts in the context of a church, to make them a unified experience, to magnify them, and also to emphasize their impact. Baroque art is primarily characterized, it's a movement that emerges in the early 1600s in Europe, and it is all about capturing psychological depth, emotion, and also drama. So this is really very exciting stuff. So most of the works that you see tonight were produced in the 1600s by Bernini and his contemporaries. And you'll see a lot of works that have religious subjects. Many of them were informed by the Roman Catholic Church's Counter-Reformation that sought to quell the rising tide of Protestantism. And we think of Protestantism as this branch of Christianity that emerges in the early 1500s with people like Martin Luther. This posed a major problem for the Catholic Church, particularly by the time we get to the mid to late 1500s, and they come up with this series of key strategies to combat the rising tide of Protestantism in Northern Europe. It is centered in Italy because that is where the Vatican is, that's where St. Peters is, and that's where the Pope is headquartered, so to speak. So Bernini is part of this when he becomes a star artist in the early 1600s. And he's going to create many works as well as his contemporaries that serve the Catholic Church's mission of promulgating Counter-Reformation ideas. You will also see mythological subjects tonight that I'm going to show you. The 1600s is what I like to call a period in which European society is on the cusp of change, of transformation. And by that, what I mean is that Europe, in many regards, because it remains traditional, of course, we're talking about Catholicism here, it remains a very religious society, but it's beginning to explore different aspects of Enlightenment thought, or at least the origins of Enlightenment thought. Europe is beginning to modernize to a certain degree. It's going to take off more in the 18th century. But as you can see here in the slide, the artwork in this two-part lecture series that we're going to look at goes all the way from roughly 1600 until 1710. So by the time we get to the end of the periods covered in this exhibition and in relevant works, you're going to see some changes that are occurring in it as well. I will also discuss next time other works, including portraiture, more historical subjects, more biblical subjects, and significantly a landscape. Bernini's aesthetics and style become a cultural phenomenon that spread concurrently throughout Europe, and in some cases, more broadly, even to the Americas. And by that, we mean the spread of Catholicism globally. The period that we're looking at and the geographic location is centered here in Italy. At the time in which Bernini lived, I should mention that Italy is not a unified nation. That doesn't happen until 1870, 71. So it's a collection of these loose states, and we are looking specifically here at Rome. But Rome in this period is so fascinating because artists from all the different Italian states, including Naples, which is where Bernini was actually born, they come to Rome to study. They come to study ancient masterworks that have been unearthed from the ancient Roman Empire, and also great Renaissance works. Artists from the north that will also come up in my talks come down to Rome. It is a hub for training artists in this period. Here are a couple of slides showing you this hill town of Ariccia. It's very beautiful. Bernini was commissioned by Pope Alexander VII Chigi to completely redesign this town, which will be the subject of another program and/or lecture. I will mention it at different times tonight, but this commission that Bernini takes on in Ariccia actually is from much later in his career, about the 1660s. And over here on the right, we have a beautiful picture of Rome at night. And this is the kind of environment which we might imagine Bernini, though not without the modern, of course, without the modern electrical lighting, in their St. Peters, which is going to figure tonight in our discussion, as well as the Tiber River. I had mentioned before this fellow Flavio Chigi. He's a tremendous art patron depicted here in this wonderful painting by Ferdinand Voet. And this is really a tour de force of a portrait. It shows the Cardinal. Ferdinand Voet was a Flemish artist who worked down in Rome. It shows him in all of his finery. And he patronizes Bernini quite a bit. He's one of the patrons who has him redesign parts of Ariccia. And the Cardinal also commissions works from many of Bernini's contemporaries, like Voet. Here he is seated in this elaborate throne as he looks off to the right. The light hits him. There's this element of spontaneity in the portrait and immediacy. Something outside the picture plane has caught the Cardinal's attention. He's very well fed. He's very well off. And he enjoys the latest fashions, as you can see here in his clothing and the ring on his pinky finger. So we have to keep this in mind that artists, in addition to Bernini, also pick up on this aspect. The Baroque is very much about this dramatic exuberance and about emotion. Now, as I mentioned before, Bernini's father is actually a sculptor, and his name is Pietro. This is a portrait that was made of him in about 1629, as you can see here. So Bernini's got some luck here. He's got his dad who's going to be able to help him along with his artistic endeavors. But Bernini is really a child prodigy. Of course, he gets training from his father, and that helps him a lot. But Bernini has this inherent talent, and he's able to create works at a very young age. So once the family relocates from Naples to Rome, he's going to help his father out. And specifically, what we're looking at here is at the Piazza di Spagna, or the Spanish Steps, a really famous monument in Rome. And it's called the Fontana della Baracaccia. And This was one of the commissions that Bernini's father received in Rome. He would have helped him with creating the designs for this and probably also chiseling and making the actual sculpture that we see here. The young artist also assists Pietro with some reliefs for a side chapel in the main Basilica of Rome, which is actually, it's one of the seats, it is the seat for the Bishop of Rome or the Pope. It's called Santa Maria Maggiore. It's an enormous church in Rome. And Pietro, of course, is commissioned to do these various reliefs based upon biblical subjects that you see in this slide. And he was quite a competent sculptor, but I would say, as you're going to see tonight, he really is outdone by his son in many regards. But this helps propel Bernini because his dad already has different links and connections established in Rome to be able to provide his son with the necessary connections that he needs to have a very successful career. Here we're looking at a print of the town of Ariccia, and this just shows the variety of different monuments, including churches, as well as the town, very much traditional. But what happens is that Bernini is actually able to, with the help of workshop assistants as well as different colleagues, to redesign the infrastructure for the town. And Falda, who created this print, Giovanni Battista Falda, was one of Bernini's students. Bernini had many different pupils, and they picked up on a number of his different principles, particularly this idea of the synthesis of the arts. So Falda will return to him at some point in another lecture. But a little background before we come back to Bernini. Where does this come from, this desire to create art in and around Rome that speaks to the tenets of the Catholic Church and specifically the Counter-Reformation? Well, it starts with artists like Caravaggio. And Caravaggio is really important to mention because he does provide some sort of inspiration to Bernini. This aspect of creating very theatrical artworks. For Caravaggio, it's through paint, with his very famous painting called The Calling of St. Matthew, which is in the church of San Luigi dei Francesi, or St. Louis of the French, in which Caravaggio takes the hand of God touching Adam and uses it here with Jesus, who's making almost a ghostly appearance in this painting. These men who are sitting here at the table, identifications have puzzled scholars for quite some time, dressed in Italian Renaissance costume, and they're reacting to this miraculous appearance of Christ here, calling Matthew to come hither. So this kind of theatrical presentation of art is very significant for somebody like Bernini, who would have known Caravaggio's work. Or, for example, his fabulous painting Narcissus, in which he's looking at his reflection in the water, falls in love with it so much, according to the classical sources, that he falls into it. Hence our word today, narcissistic. So Caravaggio uses this very dramatic technique called tenebrism, with a sharp, stark contrast between light and dark. This is what that painting looks like within the context of that side chapel in the church of San Luigi dei Francesi. Now, related to the exhibition that we have on view now, the Caravaggesque tradition is represented in part by this painting by the artist Domenico Fetti. And this is called The Suicide of Cleopatra. And it's really an outstanding painting and among my favorites in the show because of this really powerful luminism, vigorous material combinations, bold coloring, and the sharp contrast between light and dark. And as we zoom in here, you can see here this very important figure, which is Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, drawn from the Greek author Plutarch's Life of Antony. And what basically happened here is the painting is depicting a moment just before her death. It visually confronts the obsession with death that led the famous lovers, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, who you see here, of Egypt, to succumb to despair and become, quote unquote, companions in death, following their defeat by the forces of Octavian, who would later become Roman Emperor Augustus, who is going to come in there and defeat Egypt in the Battle of Actium. And what Cleopatra did was she researched and studied various deadly poisons until she chose the Egyptian cobra, also known as an asp. And here, what she's doing is she's bringing it forward. There are several others that are up in a basket here on the windowsill. She's cradled it around her arm here. And this is going to be what she's going to use as her method of choice for suicide. You have the sensual abandonment of the melancholic heroine and this transition to the languor that precedes death. Her head tipped back and with a distant gaze and very erotically an unveiled breast here, which the snake almost seems to reach out and bite in a very kind of grotesque and macabre way. The last moments that we see here before the fatal bite of the snake. So this is really representative of the Caravaggesque tradition. We have a lot of different artists who are working in this idiom. Caravaggio is a tremendous influence. And I also want to bring in one work from our collection by Marcantonio Bassetti. It's on view in our Schreiber gallery, and it's called Portrait of a Scholar. I brought it along because it really shows the influence of Caravaggio on many different artists. Now, Bassetti, like as I was mentioning before, he originally comes from Verona, which is the Veneto region of Italy, not so far from Venice. And Bassetti relocates to Rome, and he comes under the influence of Caravaggio. This painting comes from about 1621, and Bassetti had arrived in Rome about, we believe, about 1618. Here he is, just like we saw before with Ferdinand Vouet. Something's caught his attention outside the picture. See how he looks off to the left? It's as if he were writing a letter, or perhaps he's jotting down some ideas. We see his books up here on this cabinet, and it's caught him in a moment of thought. He looks off to the right here with a very composed expression, almost smiling. And it reveals the impact of the Roman sojourn on this artist. Note the shadow, tremendous use of the light, the contrast between the light and the shadow. The portrait speaks to both the inner psychology and the outer appearance of the sitter. And it's this really effectively contrast. And it's one of the key aspects of Baroque art that continues also in the work of Bernini, as we're going to see. Emotion and spontaneity. And here we come to Bernini himself and a little bit about his background. By the time he is in his 20s, he is creating magnificent sculptures, some of which I'm going to show you tonight. He becomes a rock star of Roman art, so to speak, at a very young age. On the left, he's portrayed in a portrait by the artist Ottavio Leoni, who shared a number of patrons with Bernini. The one that you're seeing there is drawn from a biography. And over on the right-hand side here, you've got his self-portrait that's in the Borghese Gallery in Rome. Already in his young age, he receives the Order of the Cross of Christ, which was an important honor that was bestowed upon him, and particularly by popes. So he really has already in the 1620s secured important patronage, particularly a man that we're going to see tonight, Cardinal Scipione Borghese, is going to help to advance his career. But before I go to that, I have a little bit of a diversion, and that is to show that Bernini was very human like many other people in his time. And there's a little bit of a dark side to the artist too. And specifically what we're looking at here is one of his lovers. Her name was Costanza Bonarelli. And Costanza was the wife of one of Bernini's assistants, whose name was Matteo. And Bernini started a very passionate love affair with Costanza. And he really loved her. And what happened one night was he discovered that Costanza had been sleeping with his brother, Luigi. So Luigi is also an artist. And when Bernini heard about this, he became livid. He was so angry that he actually went and chased his brother through the streets of Rome, who had to sequester himself inside of a church. And Bernini chased him with a crowbar. And while he was chasing him, he actually had broken his brother's two ribs. Somehow his brother managed to get into the church to avoid something worse than that might have resulted in death. So Bernini had a very cruel side to him, and he had a very bad temper. In some ways, you might say a little bit like Caravaggio, but he wasn't as unstable as the infamous Caravaggio. But this was a tremendous outburst that he had. This was in the, as I memory serves correctly, the 1620s. And this was not good for Bernini in many ways, because he's so mad at Costanza for having had an affair with his brother that he hires one of his servants to go cut her face. And this was really terribly cruel what happened. At the time, Bernini's new patron, Pope Urban VIII, Maffeo Barberini, hears about this and he says to Bernini, you need to calm down, you need to relax, and you need to get married and settle down. We can't have you as one of my main artists going around doing these kinds of things. So I bring that anecdote in because it helps to fill out the picture of the artist. There's often a romantic notion, but he did have this side to him that was very much could be prone towards violence. Interestingly, after that incident, he did marry, he did settle down. So this was from what I know, more of a one-off episode. But getting to the work of art, this work he did before the argument with Costanza. And it really shows his remarkable attention to detail in terms of the drilling out of the marble, carving of it. He's caught her right in a moment of thought. Some scholars have argued for the eroticism of this piece. It almost looks like they had just had a sexual liaison. She has also her clothing undone here. Her breast is revealed. And this work is really quite interesting to see. Scholars argue that he created it as a personal work that he would have kept with him in his studio, not intended for public display. Today, it's held by the National Museum of the Bargello in Florence. So, correction on that date there, the incident occurred actually in the late 1630s. So he's roughly in his 30s at that time, almost 40. How do we know so much about the life of Bernini? Well, it's because of several key texts. One of them, I'm showing you on the right, which precedes the one on the left, is by the famous biographer Filippo Baldinucci. And we actually have these two books on view in the exhibition in our Bear Gallery, which introduces the show. This one shows, the one that's actually an earlier biography shows Bernini in older age by one of Bernini's pupils named Baciccio, but the print is done by the Flemish artist Arnold van Westerhout. And then on the left, we have the one that I showed you before by Leone of the very famous Cavaliere Knight Gian Lorenzo Bernini. So these biographies provide a very important record of what the artist did, what were his works, his movements, his whereabouts. And these are actually etchings that were individually printed and then bound together into one volume. So it's really great to have these books. The portrait in the middle is actually Filippo Baldinucci, who's one of the most important biographers of artists after Giorgio Vasari, who's renowned for his lives of the artists during the Renaissance. In our collection, I'd like to mention that we have a couple of Ottavio Leonis. He was a very important printmaker in Rome at the time. These are going to actually be on view in our lobby installation in the coming weeks. And we encourage you to see them once they're up. The guy on the left, Giovanni Ciampoli, was actually a papal secretary, and he was a friend of Galileo. That actually got him into some trouble, of course, because of Galileo's astronomical theories, which were not in line with the church's teachings. And then on the right, we have a man named, in his Latin name there, Paul Qualiatus Claudianus, or Paolo Qualiato. Qualiato was a late Renaissance and early Baroque composer who created madrigals in Rome. But I want to draw your attention to Leone, like the other portraitists and artists we've looked at tonight, the spontaneity and the immediacy. Look at the attention to detail that he gets on the hair of Ciampoli on the left. It's really quite amazing. The details of his beard as well, not unlike Ferdinand Voet, and also of the composer that we see on the right. Now, moving on from that, we need to look at some of the sources of inspiration for Bernini. Certainly, he would have known the work of Michelangelo, and we often view Bernini as being a very important successor to Michelangelo. But for Bernini, he's looking back to the Hellenistic tradition of classical art. By Hellenistic, I mean later sculpture of the Greek and early Roman empires. And in this period, actually, it's still the Roman Republic, but Rome is expanding, with sculptures like the famous Laocoon, that was discovered during the Renaissance. The Hellenistic sculpture, like Bernini's work, is characterized by dramatic emotion. And by the attention to detail and musculature, moments of tremendous contortion, as you see here, the priest Laocoon trying to break free of the python. Bernini picks up on this idea in his work. It's very dynamic. It's all about the space around the piece, the interactivity with the viewer. And you can see that with Bernini's Rape of Persephone. This is really one of my favorite sculptures, and it's in the Borghese Gallery in Rome. So exciting, very monumental, and it shows off all of Bernini's talents. Here you can see Hades, god of the underworld, trying to abduct Persephone. And he succeeds in doing so. She tries to push him away, but that's not working. He's grabbing onto her. It shows that moment of tension, of the interaction between the two figures. And look at how he's done the drilling here on his beard, his hair, his crown. It's just extraordinary. This is what the sculptures that by Bernini look like within the context, specifically the Hades, of the Villa Borghese Gallery. This gives you a sense of its scale. And some close-ups. Look at the delicacy with which he renders the fingers. You can almost feel the flesh, the way that he sculpted this. Just absolutely remarkable. And he was only at this time in his 20s. Now I bring in a painting that's in our exhibition that's based off of a similar theme. And it's by an artist who, in many regards, couldn't be more different than Bernini. He has some of the similar ideas in mind, but he is really quite different. And that's Giuseppe Cesare, also called his nickname Cavaliere d'Arpino, which means, again, Knight of Arpino. And what we have here is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, who is shown here, the couple Orpheus. He basically had been summoned down to the underworld. And Hades says to him that you can, basically Orpheus is this figure in classical mythology who can tame the beasts, he can tame the barbarians by music and by learning. And what he does is through his charming music, he convinces Hades that he should be able to bring Eurydice back up from the underworld. You got Hades here with his pitchfork and also with Proserpina, his wife, at his side. Hades agrees to this, and he says, you can take Eurydice back with you out of the underworld, but you have to remember, you cannot look back. If you look back, you're going to disappear. You won't be able to have her. And what happens is he looks back and she vanishes. This moment of the story is really held in tension and suspense. It's very melancholic too, because it lets the viewer know that Orpheus is not going to realize his dream of taking her out of the underworld and for them to be together. It's very tender, the way that the figures are represented, but there's also this element of the threat and the power of Hades by the inclusion of the mythical beast Cerberus on the lower right. The artist Cesare, he pays particular attention to classical detail and modeling. He's not as exuberant or as dramatic as Bernini is in his sculptures. And in fact, Bernini is really quite the opposite. As you can see with his Apollo and Daphne, this is just a tremendous work. It shows this moment in which Daphne, this is based upon Ovid's Metamorphoses, the figures don't quite realize their transformation as they run. She doesn't really quite realize that she's turning into a tree. He's trying to grab onto her. She's not interested in his amorous advances. And see here how her hands sprout these leaves as they come up into the viewer space. It's just a remarkable work to see in person. It's as if they're moving through the space, through the gallery. We come to one of his most famous pieces that he made when he was young, called the David. And this is from 1623. And it's really a tour de force, this work. It is based in the Hellenistic tradition. And it's really quite unusual for the subject because it shows him preparing to slay the giant Goliath. He's putting the rock into his sling and he's preparing to fling that stone. This is in sharp contrast to previous versions that were done. For example, Renaissance artist Donatello on the left with the contemplative adolescent depiction of the young David, to the Michelangelo Michelangelo's version, which is about him contemplating the moment. And then you got Bernini, who's incorporated the workspace around it to be part of ours, to involve us in it. He portrays that moment when he's going to shoot Goliath. David is almost tense. He bites his lips, and he prepares to deal the final blow. Interestingly, some scholars have argued that the face of the David may actually be that of Bernini. And this was not uncommon for artists sometimes to use their self-portraits and incorporate it into the work. But you get that sense of the tremendous tension and emotion that's sort of almost bound up within the figure. Here are a couple of other details of this tremendous sculpture. And again, marble is a very hard material to work. It's a medium that is very challenging to work with. Very different from Bernini, and a work by the painter simply known as Sassoferrato, his full name Giovanni Battista Salvi. He, like Cesare, is very much tied to the classical Raphaelesque tradition. By that I mean I'm referring to the Italian artist Raphael, to this classicism, attention to crisp detail, and much more subdued depiction of figures. This is also one of my favorites in the exhibition. And it's really quite beautiful. This is Saint Lucy, who was an early Christian martyr who became a patron saint of blindness and eye illnesses. And here what she's doing is she is standing with her eyes, which are going to be cut out because she refuses to recant her beliefs and make a sacrifice to the Roman emperor's image. This is her martyrdom. It's really displaying the artist's refined execution, characterized by polished, clearly rendered anatomical proportions, and also a strongly symbolic image of the saint. The maimed eyes depicted on the tray, portraying her against the backdrop of a gray, cloudy sky, evoking her blindness. It conveys tremendous immediacy, emotion. It's very poignant. She looks up to heaven and God, whom she can see through the strength of faith with her mind's eyes. Bernini, on the other hand, again, always very exuberant. And here we're looking at his tomb that he creates for Pope Urban VIII over a very long period of time. It took him 20 years to finish this. And this tomb is located within the Vatican, within St. Peters, and it combines the use of marble, bronze, and gold. This shows how Bernini was able to work in multiple media. And of course, in order to achieve these works, he had to have a large group of assistants helping him out with all of this. Urban VIII becomes one of Bernini's key patrons, and he becomes actually a mentor to the artist as well. Here he is standing high above on a throne on this very elaborate pedestal. He's raised out his arm with a gesture almost as if he were commanding soldiers in antiquity. And what Bernini does is, as I mentioned before, he thinks of the arts as this synthetic whole. He tries to combine all of it here with the sculpture, with the architecture of the niche, the space around us, and we might imagine also ceremonies occurring within St. Peter's Basilica at the time. And the idea was to relate to the condition of contemporary visitors to the church. That's an important part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, is that art can be still available for those who are illiterate as well as lay. Look at how death himself is activated here as he pulls up the epitaph of Urban VIII and almost interacts with it. He's actually grasping it. And then we have different personifications, particularly Justice here with her sword on the right, looking up in contemplation. It's as if each part of the sculpture is activated and responding either directly or indirectly to each other. It's amazing. This gives you a sense of the context there with the pews within the church. And other works by Bernini from his earlier career that are some of my favorites, the portrait of Cardinal Scipione Borghese, who really helps to launch his career. 1632, again, that immediacy, the aspect of the improvisation, the improvisatory quality of Bernini's work. Look at how he's caught the Cardinal off guard here. And you'll note in this one that one of the buttons is actually undone. So it literally is if the cardinal is sitting there before him and he could almost come alive to be activated, if you will. It's just so lifelike. And to achieve this, especially look at how delicate the collar is here, this cardinal's outfit. To do this kind of work without breaking the marble took incredible skill and dexterity. In terms of representing the sculpture of Bernini in our show, we have a couple of examples. These are pretty good in terms of showing us Bernini's sculptural technique. Originally, it would have cast these probably as plaster, as studies, and then they were later cast again as bronze. And what we have is we have a medallion with Androcles and the lion that's shown on the left. This is an ancient Roman myth. And what popes and other patrons would do at this time, cardinals, is they would choose classical myths that could speak to their deeds and their ambitions. And that's exactly what happened with this work, which was commissioned by actually a cardinal named Domenico Iacovacci. His name is spelled out in Latin here in the inscription. He commissions this from Bernini so that he can give it to Pope Alexander VII Chigi as a gesture of gratitude for his support during a terrible plague that afflicted Rome from 1655 to 56. And what you have is you have the use of the classical relief by Bernini. He tries to depict very economically the emotional connection between the gladiator here, Androcles, and the lion. The lion is bowed to the gladiator during a competition, sparing him as a sign of gratitude for Androcles having removed a thorn from the animal's paw in an earlier encounter. And thus what Bernini tried to do was compare Alexander VII to Androcles and the lion to Rome, which was grateful to the Pope for his efforts in caring for the sick during that plague. And here you can see that if you were to close it, you would have on the bottom the Androcles, and then on the top of the medal, the obverse, this being the reverse, you have the portrait very carefully capturing Alexander VII. A companion piece shows Santa Maria in Trastevere, an important square in central Rome, again with the Pope shown on the right. Bernini created many preparatory drawings like the one you see here, a project for an apse in the Church of Santa Maria in Violata. Just like we saw with the tomb of Urban VIII, Bernini has to conceive of these projects very carefully on paper first. He has to consult with his assistants and, very importantly, his patrons in order to figure out how's this all going to work. Am I going to need a fresco painter, for example? Am I going to need a guy to create plaster sculpture, otherwise known as a stuccoist? And how am I going to work on the sculpture itself? Fit that into the architecture? How is light going to play off of this? That's what he's trying to work out in a piece like this, which is really very beautiful. Now what we do is we move to one of the most important commissions that Bernini received in his career, and that's the Vatican St Peters. This gives you a sense of where it is. You got the Tiber River running through Rome, and the Vatican is over here, Papal Palace, Sistine Chapel, and St. Peter's itself, with the enormous square that Bernini designs outside of it around mid-career. But he starts his work inside of St. Peter's much earlier. And in fact, St. Peter's was full of ups and downs for the artist. I put here to show you that this complex is enormous. It had been worked on by many artists, including Michelangelo, Giacomo della Porta, Carlo Maderno, who's an architect and also mentored Bernini. Many different people worked on this. And in fact, one of the things that was a problem for Bernini in this was that there started to develop cracks in the facade of St. Peter's. The Pope charges Bernini with fixing these. But what happened was Bernini thought that he could build the bell towers that you see here higher. When he does that, and this is about the 1640s, the cracks actually get worse. This embroils Bernini in about a 3 to 4 year scandal in which his rivals in Rome try to blame him for this. Depending on which scholar you read, they'll argue that in fact it was Maderno's fault because the soil underneath in the conditions, much of it is actually sand underneath, was giving way, and this caused it to collapse. This was probably one of the worst problems for Bernini his entire career. He does make a recovery from it, though. And there's an investigation done by the papal office to determine any wrongdoing. He's actually cleared of it, fully exonerated. But I like to bring that in to give you a sense that there were certainly challenges in his career. Here you had it before I show you the facade by Maderno. Bernini and others finish it. And then this enormous St. Peter's Square that Bernini designs. These enormous colonnades, the 1650s, that almost reach out and embrace the faithful. And this is, of course, today where the Pope will appear on the balcony and address and give mass to huge crowds. And certainly much so more before the pandemic. Over there is the Sistine Chapel. So Bernini is involved with this entire project. But in his day, as you're looking at the top here from St. Peter's Dome, this large avenue that leads up to it was not there. This was created by Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator, beginning in the 1920s as part of this Italian nationalistic redesigning of Rome. So in Bernini's day, when you were coming up in front of the Vatican, you would have been surprised by what you see here. It would have just hit you really very strongly, would have made an enormous impact. When we go inside, it is just amazing inside. This is his very famous Baldacchino, which he starts when he's in his 20s. It's a commission from Pope Urban VIII, and it's probably among the most famous of his whole career. It contains an enormous helmet and valance that's up here, and it looks up into the dome. There's all kinds of symbolism of the Barberini Pope. Some of it I'll go through here with these slides. If you open these doors, it goes downstairs into a sanctuary. And this is very important because this is where it was believed that St. Peter was actually buried. The Baldacchino marks the burial site of St. Peter, thought to be the place where he died under Roman Emperor Nero in the 60s CE. The bronze that you see on the piece itself was actually taken off of the capitals of the Pantheon. And when you go downstairs, this leads into another series of subchambers, which I actually had a chance to visit when I was a student in Rome. It's just amazing down there. It's actually very claustrophobic. We're above that area here. It's below those grates that you see here. The Baldacchino's spiraling columns are based on those of the Temple of Solomon, the design as described in the Old Testament, and the nails of gold derived from South America. They're just amazing. Bernini had to calculate how the light would shine into it during the day. It's just amazing. If you stay within this building for several or more hours, you get to see how the light filters through the building and how it reflects off of the Baldacchino. This is all part of Bernini's vision for how the Roman Baroque is conceived. It works together with sculpture, architecture, painting as well, and interior decoration. This would have been based upon very detailed drawings, preparatory studies. The gold actually is very precious, and it speaks to the reach of the Catholic Church across many different areas, parts of the world, because it's taken from South America. And this just shows you some of the details of this remarkable monument, the putti almost tumbling down into the viewer's space. It's the epitome of the exuberance of the Baroque. Now, Bernini was not without his rivals. Here we have Pietro Bernini, better known as Pietro da Cortona. This painting is on view in the exhibition. Now, Pietro da Cortona is a rival to Bernini and sometimes collaborator. The two did not always get along. They had different ideas about how to make art. In particular, for Cortona, it was about building up anatomical form using color. And we're talking about paintings on canvas. And the flagellation is really among the most renowned events from the Passion of Christ. In this scene, which is likely a study for a larger altarpiece, we show Christ's suffering being heightened by the guards' cruelty and their violence towards him. While the man that you see here on the right angrily pulls back Christ's hair, his confederate prepares to whip him in a moment of great tension. The composition is organized as if it were within a theatrical setting, and the figures are almost appearing like they're actors on stage, evoking by the step that divides the space within the picture and creating sort of this division between us as the spectator. See how the drape here almost falls out into our space. In addition to being a major figure of Baroque painting, Cortona is also a key architect. And the three competing with one another in Rome at the time, I'll talk about him next time, Francesco Barramundi, who was sometimes very much in competition with Bernini and did not like him. They had different principles about how to create buildings. Cortana Bernini. The three of them actually are collaborating within the Palazzo Barberini in Rome. And while I don't have as much time as I would have liked to go into detail about this, I just want to show you so you get an idea of the kind of work that Cortona did. We go upstairs inside this enormous palazzo, and by collaborating together, I mean that Bernini was in charge, actually, and Cortona and Barramundi were under him. That's because Bernini was the favorite artist of Maffeo Barberini, who was the patron of the palazzo we're looking at. But he commissions Cortona to do this enormous fresco glorifying his reign. And here we have divine providence about to be instructing this other personification here to place this crown on top of or near the keys and the bees, which are the symbols of Maffeo Barberini or Pope Urban VIII. They are almost ascending into the heavens. This is what we call an apotheosis. It's the glorification, oftentimes of a person or an abstract ideal, rising up into the heavens. And this is what Cortona, one of the things he excelled at, besides creating altarpieces like we saw before. This is what the painting looks like within the context. The walls of the palazzo are actually quite spare, but the ceiling is very elaborate. And these images were very complex, so much so that at the time a pamphlet had to be published by the papal secretary and handed out to visitors, explaining to them what they were looking at. We have some other fabulous works, and I think that before I conclude, I should be able to get up to one or two of them. We have Ciro Ferri's St. Eva Distributes Charity. This is one of my favorites in the exhibition for many reasons. It sums up in so many ways what the Catholic Counter-Reformation is about. Here we have St. Eva, Hilary of Caramartin. He was originally from France. What he's doing is he's receiving pleas and supplications from different worshipers. And in the background, you see a number of assistants are organizing books and taking notes on the register. Above on the right, cupids are shown holding up a tapestry, almost pulling up a curtain, if you will, and pushing these other figures up into the heavens. These works were meant to, once this became a final altarpiece, if it did become a final altarpiece, they were meant to provide worshipers with visual aids to the sermons they were hearing. They're surrounded by angels and saints, including Luke, Jerome, Leo the Great, Alexander, and Fortunato. The painting epitomizes the idea of charity, which is closely associated with Saint Eva. He wears a secular robe. It also refers to his theological role, his educational jurisprudence, and also the fact that he defends and cares for the poor and the powerless. This would be meant to sympathize with everyday worshipers. The fact that this saint might bring them not only relief monetarily, but also this idea of salvation, which is so central to the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation. In time for one more that really builds upon this, I should mention also, Ciro Ferri is an important pupil of Pietro da Cortona. In our exhibition, we're lucky also to have the conversion of St. Paul. So beautiful, this painting. It shows how the divine light of God, not directly depicted in terms of the figure of God, throws Paul off of his horse. This actually not necessarily directly according to the text, but embellished over the ages. That the force of God, the light of God, is so powerful that it knocks him from his horse. Caravaggio actually very famously portrayed this in one of his famous paintings that you may be familiar with. The painter's representation of God does not intervene, but it is depicted as a heavenly vision, distant in space, and fading in the light of soft colors. Baldi, like Cortona, uses bright chromatic palette to build up the figures, to create the tension. Look at how the soldiers look up and react here to what's going on in the sky. It's just tremendous. So I'm just going to scroll down here, and I would like to just show you, before I open it up to questions, I'd like to welcome you to join me next time for another installation, if you will, next edition of our Curator's Talk. It'll be on August 12th at 6 p.m., where I'm going to go into the second half of Bernini's life, sort of following it and using it as a chronology. And we're going to look at more works in the exhibition, including portraiture, mythological subjects, and religious paintings. So with that, I would like to open it up for discussion and for questions. One thing that I would like to say, oh, looks like we got some there. Feel free to ask. There are a lot of things going on in these paintings. I will say that this is just so exciting for me on a more personal note, because I study the Baroque in my graduate work. I also published my book on basically what happens to the Baroque in the 18th century in my book, Exuberant Apotheoses. And to see these works in person from a princely and noble collection in Hagerstown is such a treat. So we really encourage you, if you're able to get to the museum, to come and see these paintings. Good question, Sarah. What happens to the Baroque in the 18th century is quite interesting. It depends which scholar you look at. Some scholars will argue that with the 18th century, they say religion becomes less important. That's debatable. I think what you could say is that the Counter-Reformation in some ways wanes. The Counter-Reformation began in the 1540s. It takes off in the 1570s. But by the time we get to the 18th century, what starts to happen is artists begin to sort of relax their conventions more. And to a certain degree, they start to move more away, I would say, from religious subjects and move into secular painting. And by that, I mean you see more and more portraits. You see more historical subjects, but you also see artists looking at landscape. You see them looking at everyday life. They're continuing to look at mythological works. Brushwork and the actual pictorial surface of canvases and frescoes, I think it becomes more exuberant. And in Rome, what starts to happen is that artists begin to go to Paris because, as you can think about it, we've got a very important figure here who I will mention next time, Louis XIV. And what he does is he starts to make his court an important capital for the arts as he establishes a Royal Academy. You've got a lot of French artists who come down to Rome. And what happens is you start to have what I like to call dialogue between Paris and Rome. So the art is mutually influencing each other. So it's very interesting. But I would say that what happens, in a nutshell, is that the Roman Baroque of the 17th century that's very exuberant becomes a little bit more relaxed, and it moves towards something we call Rococo. And focuses more on aspects, for example, art of leisure, but also this sort of flamboyant and relaxed quality. So it looks like we have a comment there. Yes, indeed. The structure by Bernini in the Sistine Chapel, yes, that's a very good point. Let me go back to that. I'll have to escape for a moment. That's exactly right. The baldacchino, to elaborate a little more on your point there, it is based upon the Solomonic columns of the Temple of Jerusalem. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is that there were various accounts, it's also described in the Bible, that of this legendary Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. It was enormous. It was somewhere not far off from the Temple Mount, very much built very close to there. And basically what Bernini was charged with by Urban VIII was to create something that built off of ancient Judaic or Israeli, called Palestinian architecture. These columns were described to be swirling, to be spiraling, as if moving up towards the heavens. And the reason why Barberini commissions Bernini to do this is he thinks of himself and his Rome as a New Jerusalem. This was an idea that was written about and also promulgated throughout the Papal States and throughout Italy and Europe, that really the Pope is the king of the church, but that he descends from the ancient Hebraic or Judaic prophets. So that's the connection there. Such that it looks almost like a canopy that you'd see in a Jewish temple. Very good observation. Any other questions or comments? I love how this monument almost points up into Michelangelo's dome, finished by Vignola. It's just stunning. These are enormous pendentives that hold it up, and it projects really high up into, literally into the sky. It's like the heavens are opening up. And notice also the Holy Spirit represented by the dove here on the inside of the baldacchino. Bernini is conceiving all of this. The dove is going to ascend upward into the oculus of the dome. So, any other questions or comments that I can take at this time? All right, if not, I am going to say to everybody that I thank you very much for joining us tonight. It's wonderful to have you, and it's wonderful to talk to you about such beautiful and enthralling artwork that we have on view in this exhibition and also in other parts of the world. So I hope you'll join us next time on August 12th at 6 p.m. And then also next week, Sarah Hall and I, the director, Sarah Hall, our director, and I will be on Let's Talk Art, talking about something related to Bernini. So stay tuned for some very interesting and fun discussion.